NATO is alarmed about Russia's military buildup on Ukraine's borders, and foreign ministers from the alliance are meeting today in Latvia to discuss a response. About a month ago, the U.S. reported that Russian troops were gathering in large number in several cities near the Russian border with Belarus and Ukraine. Russia says it is entitled to station its troops on its territory, and they pose no threat. But NATO and Ukraine say Moscow may be preparing to launch an attack.
Russian troops near the Ukraine border in early November. The U.S. called it unusual activity and raised alarm over a possible invasion. Ukraine responded with its own show of force, military exercises in its border region.
We have complete control over our borders, and we are fully prepared for any escalation.
NATO pledges its support to Ukraine and is warning against Russian aggression.
It is also clear that if Russia uses force against Ukraine, that will have costs, that will have consequences, and therefore we continue to call on Russia to de-escalate.
Tensions are rising between Russia and the West over Kiev's renewed bid to join the NATO military alliance. For the Kremlin, any expansion of military aid to Ukraine is a red line.
We can't ignore these threats to the security of Russia. We will react to them as appropriate, adequately to the situation.
Ukraine already had a war scare with Russia earlier this year. In April, Russia deployed tens of thousands of troops, aircraft, and missiles within striking distance of Ukraine. Moscow called it a military exercise, and after weeks of posturing, said the troops were being withdrawn. Western military experts say the maneuvers this November were less visible, perhaps on purpose.
We don't have clarity into Moscow's intentions, but we do know its playbook.
What Ukraine and the West fear is a repeat of 2014, when Russian troops entered Ukraine, followed by the annexation of Crimea, and a bloody war between Russia-backed separatists and Ukrainian troops in the eastern Donbas region. Despite several attempts at peace talks, it's a fight with no end in sight.
The Kremlin is pushing back against claims Russia is preparing to invade Ukraine. The country's Defense Intelligence Agency chief tells the Military Times Russia has more than 92,000 troops around Ukraine's borders. He claims the forces are preparing for an attack by the end of January or beginning of February. The U.S. has reportedly shared intelligence with European allies showing the buildup of troops and weapons. The information lays out a plan in which Russian troops would cross into Ukraine in two places, Crimea and the Belarus-Ukraine border. Russian President Vladimir Putin has denied any intention to invade. The Kremlin says the U.S. is creating hysteria around the situation. Russian officials say they are alarmed about what they call a Western push to arm Kiev with high-tech weapons. For more on this, I want to bring in former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor. Ambassador Taylor, welcome. Thank you for being with us. Russia's last major incursion into Ukraine was nearly 8 years ago. They've been fighting off and on ever since. So why the escalation now?
Tanya, this is a very good question. Why now? It might be that President Putin has noticed that the Ukrainians under President Zelensky have not bent to his pressure. As you say, President Putin invaded Ukraine, both into Crimea and then into southeastern part of Ukraine, into Donbas, and thought that he would be able to exert some influence over Ukraine to bend them to his will, to try to reincorporate Ukraine into the Russian world that he is trying to reconstruct after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And he's noticed, in particular over the past year, that President Zelensky is not having it. Indeed, President Zelensky is going in the other direction. He's going toward Europe. He is going towards European values, institutions, markets, and President Putin might think that he has to do something to arrest that movement.
And Russia is denying, as it always does, that it intends to invade Ukraine. But should we believe that?
We should not believe that. We should prepare to deter that. What we should do is listen to what he's saying. He has been saying over the past 6 months, several months, that Ukraine is not really a nation. Ukraine really only exists under Russia. And that's pretty threatening. That's pretty disturbing. That together with the movements that all of the intelligence services in Europe and in the United States and in Ukraine can observe, those military movements are troubling. They happened, President Putin moved some troops around last March, April. We remember the 100,000 troops on Ukrainian border, which prompted President Biden to call President Putin to tell him to back off of Ukraine. It was in that same phone call that President Biden offered a meeting with President Putin, and President Putin responded to both the demand that he back off of Ukraine and the invitation for a meeting, and he pulled back. He didn't pull all his equipment back, but he certainly pulled a lot of his troops back, and they're back on the border now. So the question is, why is that? And should we prepare? Yes. We should prepare to impose serious, harsh sanctions that go beyond anything that we've done so far in order to deter President Putin from making that serious mistake that Secretary Blinken mentioned. That would be a serious mistake for him to invade Ukraine now.
So you're saying that the sanctions should come now, in effect, as a deterrent, because obviously if it happens afterwards, it's too late. So is that what you're suggesting?
What I'm suggesting exactly, Tanya, is that now is the time to make them ready. They need to be coordinated with the Europeans. The sanctions that we've put in place so far that have had some effect, obviously not everything that we wanted to have happen has happened, but the sanctions are effective because the Europeans and the Americans and others, the Canadians and the Japanese and the Australians, all abide by these sanctions. And that pressure comes from an international sanction. So what needs to happen now is discussions, preparations, coordination on enhanced sanctions, harsher sanctions, more serious sanctions on a broader range of the Russian economy, on specific individuals around President Putin. Those sanctions, if they're ready to go, if President Putin knows that we're preparing those sanctions, it may deter him. It may make him rethink the wisdom of invading Ukraine.
And so what is President Putin's calculation here? What does he hope to accomplish with an invasion, knowing that there would be repercussions from the international community?
It's a great question. Many people are asking exactly that question. No one has a good answer because no one knows what's in Mr. Putin's mind. One of the things that what we can tell is in his mind is what I mentioned earlier, that he's got his interest in being a historical figure in Russian history. And to be that historical figure, he needs Ukraine. Ukraine is the basis, is the foundation, is the origin of Slavic Christian civilization. And without Ukraine, President Putin cannot be this great czar, this great leader, this great Russian gatherer of lands. But that's not a rational decision. As you just indicated, it would be very painful for him, not just on these sanctions. The Ukrainian military is very different today than it was in 2014 when he invaded the first time. The Ukrainian military has been fighting, is battle hardened, it's got better equipment, it's got better leadership, it's got better training, it's got better weapons. It would be very, very painful for President Putin to do this, but that's apparently what he has in mind.
Right. Well, let's dive into that a little bit. The military repercussions, the cost in both, human life and in military treasure, because, more than 14,000 people in Ukraine have been killed since Moscow annexed the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. So what kind of conflict would a new invasion set off?
It's the right question. Of course, in addition to annexing Crimea, as you indicate, he also sent his troops, military troops, into Donbass, into two oblasts of western Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, where they still are, where they've been for the past nearly 8 years. fighting, killing Ukrainians, as you said. 14,000 Ukrainians have died in the heart of Europe in 2021. It's astounding. Where would he go with this? He probably, who knows? I mean, the military is thinking about that question. The military is planning, the Ukrainian military is planning to defend themselves. Of course, President Putin has troops in Crimea, has troops on the border with Ukraine. He has troops in Belarus, in the northern border of Ukraine. So he's got a lot of options. However, he probably knows how painful, how bloody, how horrible such an invasion would be. The Ukrainians will fight. The Ukrainians will fight ferociously for their country, for their independence, for their sovereignty. The Ukrainians will fight, and it will be bloody for the Russian military. So maybe he has in mind artillery barrages or short-range missile strikes or drone attacks. Maybe this is what he has in mind. And this needs to be the preparation that the Ukrainians are facing right now.
Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
Незамедлительно признать независимость и суверенитет Донецкой Народной Республики и Луганской Народной Республики.
Розірвали дипломатичні відносини з Росією. Україна захищається і не віддасть своєї свободи, щоб там не думали в Москві.
Just spoke with the G7 leaders this morning. We will limit Russia's ability to do business in dollars, euros, pounds, and yen to be part of the global economy. We'll limit their ability to do that.
Today, we call on Russia to stop its unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable war.
In an historic meeting, the United Nations General Assembly overwhelmingly voted to reprimand Russia for invading Ukraine and demanded that Moscow stop fighting and withdraw its military forces.
The General Assembly has spoken.
The resolution Wednesday was supported by 141 of the Assembly's 193 members and passed in a rare emergency session called by the UN Security Council, as Ukrainian forces battle to defend itself in the face of a Russian invasion that has forced hundreds of thousands to flee. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
First of all, to put the vote in the UN in perspective, it is both overwhelming and I would even say historic. Go back to 2014 when the General Assembly pronounced itself on Russia's initial aggression against Ukraine. The votes in favor of that resolution were 100.
The last time the Security Council convened an emergency session of the General Assembly was in 1982. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Linda Thomas-Greenfield called it an extraordinary moment and urged members to hold Moscow accountable for its violations of international law.
If the United Nations has any purpose, it is to prevent war. It is to condemn war, to stop war. That is our job here today. It is the job you were sent here to do, not just by your capitals, but by all of humanity.
She accused Russia of using weapons that violate international laws, including cluster munitions and vacuum bombs. Russia's UN envoy denied Moscow was targeting civilians and accused Western governments of pressuring assembly members to pass the resolution. Russia was joined by Belarus, which has served as a launchpad for Russian invasion forces, Eritrea, North Korea, and Syria in voting against the resolution. 35 members abstained, including China.
This is the problem of despotism. This is why despotism is, or even just authoritarianism, is all powerful and brittle at the same time. It's because it creates the circumstances of its own undermining. The information gets worse. The sycophants get greater in number. The corrective mechanisms become fewer. And the mistakes become much wider and much more consequential.
We've been hearing from voices both from the past and the present telling us that the reason for what has happened is, as George Kennan said, the great blunder of eastward expansion of NATO. A modern realist historian like John Mearsheimer tells us that a great deal of the blame for what we're witnessing now must go to the United States, that he calls it the great strategic blunder of the post-war era. So I thought we'd begin by your analysis of that argument.
What we have today in Russia is not some kind of surprise. It's not some kind of deviation from a historical pattern. Way before NATO existed in the 19th century, Russia looked like this. It had an autocrat, it had repression, it had militarism, it had suspicion of foreigners in the West. This is a Russia we know, and it's not a Russia that arrived yesterday or arrived in the 1990s. It's not a response to actions of the West. There are internal processes in Russia that account for where we are today.
When you talk about the internal dynamics of Russia historically, it reminds me of a piece that you wrote and was published in Foreign Affairs 6 years ago, and it began like this. For half a millennium, Russian foreign policy has been characterized by soaring ambitions that have exceeded the country's capabilities. Beginning with the reign of Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, Russia managed to expand at an average rate of 50 square miles per day for hundreds of years, eventually covering 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. And then say these high water marks aside, Russia has almost always been a relatively weak great power. So if you could expand on that and talk about how the internal dynamics of Russia have gone on to describe it both historically and in the present day under Putin, that would be, I think, very helpful.
One of the arguments I made in my Stalin book was that being the dictator, being in charge of Russian power in the world in those circumstances in that time period made Stalin who he was and not the other way around. At the same time, it feels that it has a special place in the world. It's a country with a special mission in the world. It's Eastern Orthodox, not Western. And it wants to stand out as a great power. Its problem has always been not that sense of self, not that sense of identity, but the fact that its capabilities never match those aspirations. And so it's in a struggle to live up to this aspiration that it has for itself, which it can't because the West has always been more powerful. Russia is a great power, but not the great power, except for those few moments in history that you just enumerated. And so in trying to match the West, or at least manage the differential between Russia and the West, they resort to coercion. They use a very heavy state-centric approach to try to beat the country forward and upwards in order militarily and economically, as I said, to either match the West or compete with the West.
Well, let's describe Putin and Putinism. What kind of regime is it? It's not exactly the same as Stalinism. It's certainly not the same as Xi Jinping or the regime in Iran. What are its special characteristics, and why would those special characteristics lead it to want to invade, or why would Putin want to invade Ukraine, which seems, at least from this distance, singularly stupid?
So, of course, this isn't the same regime as Stalin. It's not the same regime as the Tsars either. Of course, there's been tremendous change. Urbanization, higher levels of education, the world outside has been transformed. So that's the shock, actually. The shock is that so much has changed, and yet we're seeing this pattern that they can't really escape from, where you have an autocrat or even now a despot who's in power, making decisions completely by himself, Does he get input from others? Perhaps. We don't know what the inside looks like. Does he pay attention? We don't know. Do they bring him information he doesn't want to hear? That seems unlikely. Does he think he knows better than everybody else? That seems highly likely. Does he believe his own propaganda or his own conspiratorial view of the world? That also seems likely. These are surmises. The courage of the Ukrainian people and the bravery and smarts of the Ukrainian government and its president Zelensky galvanized the West to remember who it was.
What is the West? How to define what the West is?
The West is a series of institutions and values. The West is not a geographical place. Russia is European, but not Western. Japan is Western, but not European. Western means rule of law, democracy, private property, open markets, respect for the individual, diversity, pluralism of opinion, and all the other freedoms that we enjoy, which we sometimes take for granted. We sometimes forget where they came from, but that's what the West is. And that West, which we expanded in the 90s, and in my view, properly, through the expansion of the EU and the expansion of NATO, that West is revived now. And that West has stood up to Vladimir Putin in a way that neither he nor Xi Jinping expected. And so if you assume that the West was just going to fold because it was in decline and it ran from Afghanistan, if you assume that the Ukrainian people were not for real, were not a nation, if you assume that Zelensky was just a TV actor, a comedian, a Russian-speaking Jew from Eastern Ukraine, if you assumed all of that, maybe you could take Kiev in 2 days or 4 days or 5 days. But those assumptions were wrong.
Let's discuss the nature of the regime, because it seems to me that the Putin regime changed somewhat. That Putin came in and there were these figures called the oligarchs from the Yeltsin years. There were 7, 8, 9 of them, and they were read the Riot Act, stay out of politics. You can keep your riches, but stay out of politics. And those who kept their nose in politics, like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, were sent to prison, and others left the country with as much of their fortune as possible. But we still talk about oligarchs. What actually is the nature of the regime and the people who are loyal to it and the people who are important in it?
So you have a military police dictatorship in charge with a finance ministry macroeconomic team running your fiscal military state. And so those people are jockeying. Who gets the upper hand? Because for the macroeconomic stability, for the economic growth, you sort of need decent relations with the West. But for the military security part of the regime, which is the dominant part, the West is your enemy. The West is trying to undermine you. It's trying to overthrow your regime in some type of so-called color revolution. And so what happens, the balance of those groups shifted more in favor of the military security, let's call it the thuggish part of the regime. And of course, that's where Putin himself comes from. The oligarchs were never really in power under Putin. What he did was he clipped their wings. They worked for him. And if they didn't work for him, they could lose their money. And so he rearranged the deck chairs. He gave the money. He allowed expropriation by his own, quote, oligarchs, by people who grew up with him, played judo with him, summered with him. And those people who were in the KGB in St. Petersburg, known as Leningrad back in the day, or were in post-Soviet St. Petersburg, those people began to become oligarchs, to expropriate the property, to live the high life. And some of the early Yeltsin era people were either expropriated, fled, or were forced out. And so he built a regime in which private property, once again, was dependent on the ruler. And everybody knew this, and if they didn't know, they learned the lesson the hard way. And sadly, what that did was It encouraged people all up and down the regime to the lowest levels to start stealing other people's businesses and property. It became a kind of free-for-all. If it was good enough for Putin and his cronies, it's good enough for me.
But such people in such a regime, it seems to me, would care above all about wealth, about the high life, about power. Why would they care about Ukraine?
It's not clear that they do. We're talking about one person here. We're talking at most about 6 people, but certainly one person as the decision maker.
Kenya and almost every African country was birthed by the ending of empire. Our borders were not of our own drawing. They were drawn in the distant colonial metropoles of London, Paris, and Lisbon, with no regard for the ancient nations that they cleaved apart. Today, across the border of every single African country live our countrymen with whom we share deep historical, cultural, and linguistic bonds. At independence, had we chosen to pursue states on the basis of ethnic, racial, or religious homogeneity, we would still be waging bloody wars these many decades later. Instead, we agreed that we would settle for the borders that we inherited, but we would still pursue continental political, economic, and legal integration. Rather than form nations that looked ever backwards into history with a dangerous nostalgia, we chose to look forward to a greatness none of our many nations and peoples had ever known. We chose to follow the rules of the Organization of African Unity and the United Nations Charter, not because our borders satisfied us, but because we wanted something greater, forged in peace. We believe that all states formed from empires that have collapsed or retreated have many peoples in them yearning for integration with peoples in neighboring states. This is normal and understandable. After all, who does not want to be joined to their brethren and to make common purpose with them? However, Kenya rejects such a yearning from being pursued by force. We must complete our recovery from the embers of dead empires in a way that does not plunge us back into new forms of domination and oppression. We rejected irredentism and expansionism on any basis, including racial, ethnic, religious, or cultural factors. We reject it again today.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're joined by Professor Stephen Zunis of the University of San Francisco. He recently published an article in The Progressive headlined, "The U.S. Hypocrisy on Ukraine." Zunis condemns the Russian invasion, but criticizes what he sees as President Biden's hypocrisy. He writes, if Biden really believed countries have a right to self-determination, he would not refuse to recognize this right for Western Sahara, as the International Court of Justice in virtually every country on earth has called for, nor would he refuse to support Palestinian self-determination outside the parameters agreed to by their Israeli occupiers. That's Professor Zunis's words. He's written extensively on Western Sahara, which has been occupied by Morocco since 1975. As we see the Russian invasion of Ukraine play out, Stephen Zunis, talk about why you're talking about Western Sahara.
Well, Trump formally recognized Morocco's illegal annexation of Western Sahara during his final weeks of his presidency. And like a number of impetuous Trump decisions, it was assumed that Biden would reverse it as soon as he came to office, particularly since a bipartisan group of congresspeople, career State Department officials, and allied governments were encouraging to do so. He's refused to do so, however. The United States is virtually the only country in the world, the only country to formally recognize Morocco's illegal annexation. If you look at maps from the United Nations, from Google, from Rand McNally, National Geographic, whatever, they're depicted as two separate countries. U.S. government maps, by contrast, show Western Sahara as part of Morocco, no demarcation between them. So when Biden says that Russia has no right to unilaterally change international boundaries, that countries cannot expand their territory by force, he's certainly correct, but he seems to think it's okay if you're a U.S. ally like Morocco.
And talk about why you also, in the same articles, talk about both Palestine and Western Sahara. And then there's a link with Trump pushing Morocco and accepting their power over Western Sahara.
Well, the United States is also the only country in the world that has formally recognized Israel's illegal annexation of Syria's Golan Heights. We've made a de facto recognition of Israel's annexation of Greater East Jerusalem. And since the Trump administration, we have considered the illegal settlements as part of Israel.
Palestinians en route to Friday prayers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem's Old City, the Holy City. But peace here remains as elusive as the light that flits across the shadows of its ancient walkways. The stone beneath passing feet may have been smoothed and mellowed by time, but not so the conflict that still defines Israelis and Palestinians, as sharp and as far from resolution as ever. This is the latest battlefront, a garden in a Palestinian neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah in occupied East Jerusalem, captured from Jordan by Israel in 1967 and later annexed in a move not recognized by the international community. Reem Hamad has brought her children to the house she was born in, where her parents still live and now face eviction from, along with a number of other Palestinian families in the neighborhood. The children are painting signs about their plight.
It's very important for the little ones to know the history and to stay attached to their land, and to know that it's their land, it's not anybody else's land, it's theirs.
It was given to Ahmad's parents and 27 other Palestinian families in the 1950s, part of a plan by Jordan to house refugees from the wars surrounding the creation of the Israeli state in 1948. The United Nations paid for houses to be built on the land.
We were actually people who came from all over the country, from Haifa, from Akka, from Jaffa, from all over the country, as refugees seeking shelter and seeking safety here in Jerusalem. And some even came from the west side of Jerusalem, the western Jerusalem.
Israeli law allows Jewish citizens to reclaim pre-1948 property as long as they can prove title to it. The settler groups trying to evict the Palestinian families claim to have bought the land from two Jewish trusts that bought the land at the end of the 19th century. Those claims have been upheld by a lower court in Israel, and it's now before the Supreme Court. At least one hearing delayed because of its incendiary nature.
We have one city, and we had a war in 1948. 2,000 Jews were displaced, 20 to 30,000 Palestinians were displaced. The Jews may recover their property, the Palestinians may not.
Daniel Siedemann is an Israeli lawyer who's worked on settlement issues in Jerusalem for 30 years. He says the Palestinians are right to be worried that the settlers have the full backing of the Israeli government.
The only people who have ever lived in these homes are the Palestinians who are living there. It is their memories. Today it is settlers who have absolutely no connection to this site. Not one of the original owners pre-1948 has returned to Sheikh Jarrah. It all goes to the settlers as ideological trinkets.
A number of groups in Jerusalem raise funds, mostly from abroad, to support nationalist religious Jewish settlers in their efforts to displace Palestinians. Daniel Luria is a spokesman for one called Ataret Kohanim.
let's understand something, that the land of Israel, Judea and including Judea and Samaria, and the whole of Jerusalem, there's only one sovereign body here. There's only one people that have a connection to this land. There is no such thing as a Palestinian people, no such thing as a Palestinian state, and there's no such thing as any sovereignty by anyone except the Jewish people here.
Hardline Jewish settlers took over one of the houses opposite Reen Hamad's parents' house in Sheikh Jarrah about 10 years ago. It sits fortified and decked out in security cameras. The street has since become a rallying point for Palestinians opposing the potential evictions. In early May, there were almost nightly clashes between Palestinians, Israeli settlers, and police. Israeli police have since blocked the entrance. For many Palestinians, Sheikh Jarrah has become emblematic of their struggle against the Israeli occupation, now more than half a century old. And it is a younger generation carrying the torch, harnessing social media to their cause. This video went viral.
Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
it's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
No one is allowed to steal it, ya ammi.
Samira Dajani and Adel Boudera are also facing eviction, their families' original homes in West Jerusalem. Dajani says young Palestinians, both here and abroad, are making a difference.
Before there was no enough power to spread our opinions here and there, but now I think this is the reason.
They have two daughters living in Canada.
We didn't know how to tackle this cause, and we lost a lot of supporters all over the world. Now, as Samira said, the youth are better than us, better than our generation.
They're convinced the insertion of Jewish settlers into East Jerusalem is part of a deliberate plan to thwart the possibility of it ever serving as the capital of an independent Palestinian state. Israel claims Jerusalem as its undivided capital. The idea of a two-state solution to the conflict has been gathering dust in the corner for a few decades now, despite the lip service paid to it by the international community whenever convenient. There are those who say it's time to pick it up again.
We Israelis are sipping cappuccino on the edge of a volcano.
Daniel Siedemann says to ignore what's happening would be a mistake for Israel.
I'm an Israeli, I'm a Zionist, I consider myself a patriot. Israel is consistently engaged in policies that decent people cannot support. But we're seeing a large-scale erosion of support for Israel for reasons that I very much understand, and a growing support for the Palestinians, which I also understand.
But there are leadership vacuums amongst Palestinians and Israelis alike. The Palestinian Authority in the occupied territories, seen by its own people as corrupt and moribund. And Israel has had a staggering 4 elections in the past 2 years. The religious right still dictating whether governments will stand or fall. It is not the time, say optimists and pragmatists alike, for the outside world to look away. Margaret Evans, CBC News, Jerusalem.
About the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman rule for centuries, was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling into farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states. One for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence, and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan, and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war. But in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the US-brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years. even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut.
The stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and planes.
The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land for Israel, some just because the housing is cheap, often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, others are small communities deep into the West Bank.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
Settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent. Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis, over 1,000 Palestinians died in the First Intifada. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza, considered the PLO too secular, too compromise-minded, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protests peace talks with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. But this violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace, keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace drag on for years, and a big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. Palestinians come to believe peace isn't coming, rise up in a second intifada, this one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. The second intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace or that it's even worth trying. Israeli politics shift right, the country builds walls and checkpoints to control Palestinians' movements. They're not really trying to solve the conflict anymore, just manage it. The Palestinians are left feeling like negotiating didn't work and violence didn't work, and that they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Hamas gains power, but splits from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel puts Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rises to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know it today. It's relatively new, and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Bank, more and more settlements are smothering Palestinians, often respond with protests and sometimes with violence, though most just want normal lives. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, including lots of civilians. In Israel itself, most people have become apathetic. For the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from their daily lives, with moments of brief but horrible violence. There's little political will for peace. No one really knows where the conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada, maybe the Palestinian Authority collapses. But everyone agrees that things as they are now can't last much longer, Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is too unstable to last, and that unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse.
And so there's a link there, but we're not talking about a whole nation when we're talking about Western Sahara. And what's interesting, and this development just happened last week, we had thought we had scored a great victory when Congress blocked U.S. military cooperation with the repressive armed forces of Morocco until Morocco agreed to find a mutually acceptable political solution to Western Sahara. But the Biden administration just recently claimed that Morocco had done so via their dubious autonomy plan, which denies the people their right to self-determination, as the United Nations World Court has demanded. It rules out independence and makes permanent the occupation. I mean, if Russia conquered 80% of Ukraine and offered some vague form of autonomy under Russian sovereignty, would Biden find that it constitute a mutually acceptable political solution? But this is what U.S. policy is. And again, we are a big outlier here, just as we're trying to lead the world in upholding these international legal norms against the expansion of territory by force.
A conflict frozen for 3 decades, but never resolved. Now a fragile truce in the Western Sahara between Morocco and a pro-independence group is under threat. The Polisario Front has been fighting for an independent state in Western Sahara, an area wedged between Mauritania to the south and Morocco to the north, with a population of around 500,000 people. But Morocco also claims this vast stretch of desert. Rabat accuses the Polisario Front of blocking a main highway that's preventing the flow of goods between Mauritania and Morocco. But the Polisario Front accuses Morocco of carrying out attacks against its people and of igniting war.
Morocco has publicly and officially acknowledged the fact of launching an armed attack on a group of civilians demonstrating peacefully in Western Sahara, a blatant violation of the ceasefire, and it has led to the resumption of hostilities between the Moroccan occupying forces and the forces of the Frente Polisario.
Morocco's government held an emergency meeting to address the situation.
This road is important when it comes to the movement of civilians and goods, and because such actions were a violation of the UN-sponsored ceasefire agreement, Morocco, in order to fulfill its duties, ordered its military forces to intervene and build a sand barrier to protect the area from any future breaches.
Negotiations between Morocco, the Polisario, Algeria and Mauritania have remained suspended for several months. The UN is calling for restraint.
The Secretary-General remains committed to doing his utmost to avoid the collapse of the ceasefire that has been in place since 6 September 1991. And he is determined to do everything possible to remove all obstacles to the resumption of the political process.
The two sides have battled for control of the region since 1975, when Spain pulled out of the area. Morocco took control, but an armed rebellion led to a war that continued until 1991, when the UN brokered an armistice. But it's a conflict that's left tens of thousands of people displaced from their homes. Many of the Sahrawi refugees have been living for decades in vast, sprawling camps along Algeria's border with Morocco. The conditions are harsh, and they continue to rely on humanitarian assistance to survive. But the political impasse continues, and it's unlikely these people will return to their homes anytime soon.
Sitting on the northwest coast of the African continent, Western Sahara covers around 250,000 square kilometres, or roughly 100,000 square miles. In terms of size, this makes it a little larger than the United Kingdom. In another timeline, the territory would today be a full member of the United Nations, following a case of successful decolonisation by Spain in the mid-1970s. Instead, it exists in a strange limbo. Although an independent state has been declared, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, which has been recognised by over 40 countries and has been a full member of the African Union since 1984, the country in fact exists in little more than name only. The government in exile, which is based in neighbouring Algeria, controls a mere third of the territory, an area of sparsely inhabited desert. Meanwhile, the remaining two-thirds of the territory is occupied by Morocco. It claims sovereignty over what it calls its southern provinces, even though this claim is not formally recognised by any other country in the world. So, how did Western Sahara find its path to full independence and sovereignty thwarted and its territory divided and occupied? For our purposes, the story begins in 1884, when Spain seized control of a large swathe of Atlantic coast of Africa, a territory that would eventually become known as Spanish Sahara. However, Spain's claim to the territory started to come into question following its admission into the United Nations in 1955. In 1956, the UN Secretary General wrote to all the new members asking them to state whether they held any territories that fell under the terms of Article 73 of the UN Charter regarding non-self-governing territories. At first, Spain refused to reply. However, when it eventually did so, it argued that its territories in Africa didn't fall under the definition of non-self-governing territories. Instead, it said that they were formal provinces of the Spanish state. Despite this, in the years that followed, pressure grew on Madrid to accept its colonial role in the territories. However, matters were complicated by the fact that the territory was now claimed by two neighbouring states. Lying immediately to the north of Spanish Sahara, Morocco, which had become independent from France in 1956, laid claim to the region, arguing that it was part of its historic territory. Meanwhile, Mauritania, lying immediately to the south and east of the Spanish Sahara, and which also became independent from France, this time in 1960, also claimed sovereignty over parts of the territory. This created an obvious tension. While many undoubtedly expected decolonisation as opening the way for possible independence for Spanish Sahara, Morocco and Mauritania saw things very differently. They argued that while UN General Assembly Resolution 1514, the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples, envisaged the option of independence for non-self-governing territories, it also provided for the integration of colonial territories with independent states. To this end, they supported UN calls for decolonisation of Western Sahara and sought to win round other members to their claims to the territory. On the 16th of December 1965, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 2072, urgently requesting the government of Spain as the administering power to take immediately all necessary measures for the liberation of the territories of Ifni, otherwise known as Spanish Morocco, and Spanish Sahara from colonial domination. This was followed a year later by General Assembly Resolution 2229, which called for Spain to determine, in conformity with the aspirations of the indigenous people of Spanish Sahara and in consultation with the governments of Mauritania and Morocco and any other interested party, the procedures for the holding of a referendum under United Nations auspices with a view to enabling the indigenous population of the territory to exercise freely its right to self-determination. By the early 1970s, Spain's position was increasingly untenable. Not only was it facing pressure to decolonise from the UN, Morocco and Mauritania, in addition, an indigenous liberation movement, the Polisario Front, was established in Western Sahara to secure the territory's independence. In late 1973, UN General Assembly Resolution 2983 called on Spain to withdraw from the territory and, following consultations with Morocco and Mauritania, for a referendum to be held on the territory's future. Seeing the direction things were now going, Madrid agreed to hold a vote in 1975. And over the course of the following year, the Spanish government held consultations with the Moroccan and Mauritanian governments. However, clearly sensing that decolonisation could lead to independence, Morocco and Mauritania now sought to confirm their claim to the territory. In September 1974, the Moroccan government proposed that Morocco and Spain jointly submit the question of the Western Sahara to arbitration of the International Court of Justice. When Spain refused, Morocco and Mauritania took the matter to the UN General Assembly again. On the 13th of December 1974, the General Assembly passed Resolution 3292, requesting an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. Specifically, it asked the court two questions. One, was Western Sahara at the time of colonization by Spain a territory belonging to no one, terra nullius? If the answer to the first question is in the negative, two, what were the legal ties between this territory and the Kingdom of Morocco and the Mauritanian entity? The proceedings got underway in early 1975. On the 16th of October, the court delivered its opinion. First of all, the judges decided that the territory could not be regarded as terra nullius. In accordance with the resolution, the second question was now addressed, how this related to Morocco and Mauritania. On this, the court stated, the materials and information presented to the court show the existence at the time of Spanish colonization of legal ties of allegiance between the Sultan of Morocco and some of the tribes living in the territory of Western Sahara. They equally show the existence of rights, including some rights relating to the land, which constituted legal ties between the Mauritanian entity as understood by the court and the territory of Western Sahara. However, and crucially, the justices then stated, on the other hand, the court's conclusion is that the materials and information presented to it do not establish any tie of territorial sovereignty between the territory of Western Sahara and the Kingdom of Morocco or the Mauritanian entity. Thus, the court has not found legal ties of such a nature that might affect the application of Resolution 1514 in the decolonisation of Western Sahara and, in particular, of the principle of self-determination through the free and genuine expression of the will of the people of the territory. The advisory opinion was a turning point in the story, as the court had essentially decided that neither Morocco nor Mauritania had a prior legal claim to the territory and that the people should be allowed to decide their own future. This should have opened the way for a free and fair referendum on the future of the territory, including the option of independence. However, Morocco and Mauritania saw things differently. They decided to ignore the advisory opinion, or at least read it incredibly selectively and take matters into their own hands. The very next day, the 17th of October 1975, Morocco called on its citizens to mobilise. 2 weeks later, at the start of November, over 1/3 Moroccans gathered near the border and crossed into Western Sahara, supported by Moroccan troops. Meanwhile, Spain now decided to abandon the territory. On the 14th of November, it signed an agreement, the Madrid Accords, with Morocco and Mauritania that effectively allowed the administration of Western Sahara to be divided between these two countries. On 26th of February 1976, Spain announced its full withdrawal from Spanish Sahara. The next day, Polisario announced the creation of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. However, the country's hopes of full independence had been thwarted. By this stage, Morocco was in control of the northern 2/3 of the country and Mauritania the southern third. For its part, Polisario was forced to set up its government in exile in neighbouring Algeria, which shares a short border with Western Sahara. Although Mauritania withdrew from Western Sahara just 3 years later in 1979, over 4 decades later, Morocco still retains effective control over the majority of Western Sahara. In doing so, it continues to deny the people of Western Sahara a right to freely and fairly determine their own future, including the option of independence. We have a tendency to think of decolonisation as a process leading to independence. However, this was not always the case. Occasionally, countries would see the departure of a colonial power as a chance to take control of territories that they regarded as rightfully theirs, thereby denying the inhabitants of their right of self-determination. Western Sahara is a clear example of this. In this case, Spain's departure was seen by Morocco and Mauritania as an opportunity to seize the territory. even though the right of self-determination had been explicitly recognised by the United Nations and their legal claim to the territory had been rejected by the International Court of Justice. For this reason, the case of Western Sahara should be understood as a case of denied self-determination.
From air, land, and sea, Russia had been proudly showing off its military might for months. And it was no secret that it was far superior to Ukraine's. Before the war started, Ukraine's armed forces were at around 500,000, but Russia's were almost 3 times that at more than 1.3 million. While Ukraine had around 2,500 tanks, Russia had nearly 12,500, almost 5 times its neighbours. Ukraine's total aircraft strength, including warplanes and attack helicopters, stood at 318. Russia's was more than 4,000. But a month after the war began, these figures have probably changed dramatically, with losses on both sides. The Russian Navy has continued to play a crucial role in the Kremlin's war efforts. Caliber cruise missiles are integral to the Navy's ground strike capabilities. It's believed one was used to hit this government building in the city of Kharkiv at the beginning of March. Russian Iskander short-range ballistic missiles have also been used in Kharkiv and other Ukrainian cities. And Moscow has been accused of using cluster bombs on residential areas, which would constitute a war crime. The Kremlin has also claimed it's fired hypersonic missiles like these at targets in Ukraine, although this has not been independently verified. No one knows how much further Russia will go in its assault on Ukraine, nor how long Ukraine can withstand attacks like these.
We're back with our World Lead live from Lviv, Ukraine. Ukrainian officials say there is new audio from intercepted radio traffic revealing Russian soldiers talking about killing and raping Ukrainian civilians. As CNN's Matthew Chance reports for us now, these recordings paint a bigger picture of Russian soldiers who are inexperienced and also seemingly guilty of war crimes. Again, we have to warn you, the images you're about to see are graphic.
This is a war with mass digital evidence. Every Russian atrocity could be recorded, and as the Kremlin's finding out, every illegal order potentially intercepted and exposed.
Машина проехала, не увидели там машины или техника, и 2 человека с рощи по гражданке.
Да валите всех нахуй там, ебаный в рот, блядь.
Я понял. Тут вся деревня в гражданке.
Блядь. Едет гражданская нахуй, в расход, сука, всех.
Intentionally targeting civilians, something Russia categorically denies is a war crime. Kremlin blames Ukrainian forces for the devastation and the bloodshed. But hours of audio recordings said to be of Russian soldiers communicating with their commanders and released by the Ukrainian security services seem to tell a very different story. One of civilian areas laid to waste by Russian forces on purpose.
Лупи везде, блядь. По западу, нахуй, по населенным пунктам прямо, хуярь, блядь. Понял, нет? Делаю, так и делаю. На запад мне кинь туда, нахуй, несколько штук, блядь. Вот эти все ближайшие, нахуй, вот от меня там, блядь. Куриловка, Рябушки, оттуда, по-моему, работают, да? Да. Все, понял, сейчас передам координаты. Ебани туда нахуй побольше, блядь, чтобы сравнять эти 2 села, блядь.
And killing civilians isn't the only excess of which Russian forces are accused. Multiple reports have emerged of rape of young women, even children, by rampaging troops. One intercept records a Russian soldier in a tank regiment telling a horrified woman on the other end of the line what he knew.
Тут, короче, вообще танкистов 3. Взяли девчонку, изнасиловали.
Кто?
3 танкиста. 16-летнюю девчонку.
Наши?
Да.
But these are not the crimes of victors. Time and again, Russian armour has been ravaged by Ukrainian forces amid reports of severely disrupted supply lines.
Кормят-то хорошо. Да нормально, сами питаемся. Нормально. Мне собаку зарезали, съели нормально.
And plunging morale among inexperienced soldiers, some as young as 18. Disturbed by the violence and desperate for peace so they can go home.
Уебали и съебались сидеть нахуй, лишь бы нахуй не влетело.
Ты будешь ветераном спецоперации на Украине. Путин подписал приказ.
Ветераны, ебало эти все медали, нам тут медалей нахуй наобещали. Типа вы каждый получите медаль, еще за эту медаль деньги. Я говорю, идите вы нахуй, везите меня домой, и мне нахуй ваши медали.
But instead of medals, there are now growing calls for those suspected of war crimes to be tried. It may never happen, but forensic teams are in Ukraine piecing together evidence just in case. Already, there are thousands for whom justice must be done.
Well, Jake, this conflict continues to be absolutely shocking. It's just that the conduct of those Russian soldiers appears to be, well, I mean, it's just outrageous. And US officials say that the Russians are, doubling down on a recruitment drive, they say, to recruit upwards of 60,000 more soldiers to bolster their forces in Ukraine and elsewhere. Jake.
Kramatorsk train station. Women, children and babies crammed together. All here because they've been told for days to evacuate their homes in eastern Ukraine. A new Russian invasion is expected any day. They've come to flee for their lives. This morning, a bomb was fired into the middle of the crowd. It doesn't get much lower than targeting refugees. Desperate people at their most vulnerable, forced to watch their loved ones now die in front of their eyes. Everything exploded, this witness says. It was all of a sudden. Many people are dead. The regional governor says at least 50 have been killed. 5 are children and 100 more are injured. In the Kramatorsk hospital, the damage done is all too clear. Psychologically, this is hard, the nurse says. All these children killed. I can't find the words. This man asks, what have Ukrainians done to deserve this? Remnants of a missile were found with a message written in Russian. For our children, it says, suggesting it was a deliberate attack carried out in revenge. They are Russian fascists, this man says. They even wrote on it that it was to avenge their children. The US says this was Russia, using an SS-21 ballistic missile, but the Kremlin has denied Russian responsibility. And speaking to the Finnish parliament, Ukraine's president was clear nobody could mistake Kramatorsk for a military target.
This is an ordinary railway terminal. People crowded, waiting for their trains to be evacuated to the safe territory. They hit these people. There are witnesses, there are videos, there are remnants of the missiles and dead people.
Senior EU representatives today came to Ukraine under pressure to get tougher on Russian sanctions.
How are you? Thank you so much.
While here, Ursula von der Leyen was taken to Bucha to bear witness to another atrocity from Russia's invasion, where civilians have been found executed.
Here in Bucha we saw our humanity being shattered, and it is, the whole world is mourning with the people of Bucha.
The massacre in Bucha shocked the world, But President Zelensky has warned what happened in Borodyanka is even worse. Here, Russian bombs have ripped through people's lives and their homes. It was sudden, the kitchen is set, the last meal still sits on the table. This is not a rescue mission. They're not expecting to find anyone under this rubble still alive. They are now looking for the missing and trying to uncover more of the hidden horrors from this war. The dead here are still being counted, 30 found in 3 days. But they know more than 100 at least were hiding in the basements when Russia's bombs fell. Each ruined apartment in Borodyanka is now a tomb to a mass grave below.
Benjamin Ferencz, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
It's really extraordinary to be able to talk to you because of your vast experience that's so relevant now as always. I just wonder, because I've heard that you can do it, recite from memory your opening statement from your prosecuting case back in September of 1947 at Nuremberg.
Well, that's quite a challenge, but if I recall it, may it please your honors, it is with sorrow and with hope that we here disclose the deliberate murder of over 1 million innocent and defenseless people. Vengeance is not our goal,
nor do we seek merely a just retribution. We ask this court to affirm by international penal action man's right to live in peace and dignity, regardless of his race or creed. The case we present
is a plea of humanity to law.
Oh, that is extraordinary to hear that now. And I asked you because you've had a remarkable career. Even before you were prosecutor, you were in World War II, you landed in Normandy, it was around the Battle of the Bulge, but afterwards you were assigned to go to the death camps, to Buchenwald, to Dachau, to try to collect the evidence.
The Nuremberg trials are remarkable in many ways. Until then, war crimes or crimes against humanity were not clearly defined legally or not defined at all. At the same time, however, the defendants were to be granted a fair trial in accordance with the rule of law, while the global public was to be educated on the crimes of the National Socialist regime, and a legal foundation for dealing with future wars was to be established. Additionally, for the first time in history, leading members of a government were put on trial before an international court. The major war criminals trial against 21 high-ranking representatives of the Nazi regime was held from November 20th, 1945 until 1946 in the courtroom 600 of the Nuremberg Palace of Justice. The so-called follow-up trials were concluded in 1949. For the first trial, 4 judges and 4 alternate judges of the Allied powers were to determine the personal guilt of the defendants and find an adequate sentence. The indictments referred to crimes unprecedented in scale. These were, among others, planning and waging a war of annihilation, systematic mass murder, displacing civilian populations, and the destruction of entire cities. The task of the 4 prosecution teams was not an easy one. Even though the crimes of the Germans during the Second World War were committed for the whole world to see, were well documented, and there were many witnesses, a conviction was uncertain because the legal foundation for the trials had only been created with the London Charta and had not yet been proven. The trials were therefore especially important in order to find a legal response for crimes committed during the war. The different sentences then made it very clear that the trials were not about taking revenge, but about judging the crimes based on the existing documents and depositions. This notion is further supported in the defense counsel. All of them did their job voluntarily and had different reasons for participating in the trials. And last but not least, the press has to be mentioned. From the beginning, the Allies were aware of its importance. In order to secure the coverage of the trial that would be as complete as possible, office space, accommodation, and additional seats were created for the media representatives. And the demand was high. Reporters from over 20 nations took part and produced content for newspapers, the radio, and even film. This was done for the global public to enable it to form a detailed opinion of the trials and all of those involved. But there's another particularity to be mentioned. Due to the internationality of the trials, for the first time ever, a team of female and male interpreters simultaneously translated into all the relevant languages. A very difficult task, considering that many interpreters were themselves affected by the war. Despite the overwhelming media response and the pioneering role of the trials, for example, for the International Criminal Court in The Hague, it would be wrong to call them a success story only. Although most states today are committed to human rights and international law, the implementation of these principles is often challenged by foreign policy and the interests of individual states. This makes it all the more important to continue the public conversation about the Nuremberg trials and their significance in the future.
I had not been originally assigned as a trial lawyer. I had come out of the Harvard Law School with honors, specializing with, I was a researcher for a professor of international criminal law, and I was eager to use the material I had, and so they assigned me the job as chief prosecutor. I presented my case in 2 days, and rested my case, and convicted all of the 24 selected high-ranking Nazi officials. 13 of them were sentenced to death. It was a historic trial, and the convictions and the prosecution made history.
Mr. Ferenc, when you see what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, you know, we also have found ourselves scenes of bodies summarily executed, just the worst horrors as the Russian forces retreat from around Kyiv. What do you think all these years later, given what you hoped would be the case in holding that kind of crime accountable back in the Holocaust?
I am heartbroken. I have spent the rest of my life after the Holocaust trying to create a world of peace and harmony for everyone, regardless of their race or creed. And we've been making some progress in that direction by creating new international criminal courts, by teaching humanitarian law in universities. But to see it happening again, very similar, kids being shot, homes being blown up, it pains me to see that we have learned so little from the Holocaust and from the trials. I hope that we will come to our senses soon. I am urging a ceasefire immediately to all the troops engaged in these combats, and use that ceasefire time to promise them a conference of all the leading participants in the next couple of weeks to find a peaceable solution, as was anticipated when the United Nations Charter was drawn up. And the most important quote that I have for you is a quote of my commanding general during the war, commander of all of the Allied forces, later General Dwight D. Eisenhower, later President of the United States. As President, he was leaving, he said, in a very real sense, we can no longer rely on force. If civilization is to survive, it must turn to the rule of law. Those have been my guiding lights. Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the wisdom that he passed on to the rest of the world, and which unfortunately is being disregarded today.
Disregarded terribly by Russia, which was in part an ally during World War II and actually helped liberate some of those camps. It is extraordinary to see what they are perpetrating today in Ukraine. So, Mr. Ferenc, do you think somebody like Vladimir Putin and his commanding generals can be held accountable. Already, our world leaders are accusing him of war crimes. We journalists and others have discovered the evidence. And today we have the video. All those years ago, you had the documents. Do you believe that he can be held accountable?
Certainly, he can be held accountable. You cannot justify, by any argument, the murder of young children, taking them out of hospitals, killing their parents. That's what's happening repeatedly. And we have crimes against humanity have been punishable not only in Nuremberg, but later in many jurisdictions. And these are crimes against humanity. You have aggression. The invasion of Ukraine would probably classify as a clear case of aggression. And murder has always been a crime against humanity. So there is no difficulty in classifying the nature or the existence of the crimes under which whoever is responsible for it can be held to account. And Mr. Putin, if he be the man who's been behind all this, would certainly have a tough time walking out of the courtroom.
So how do you envision that, and in what kind of courtroom? Because you were, instrumental in helping to set up the International Criminal Court, but neither Russia nor Ukraine and nor the United States of America are signatories and participants. How do you envision, in what forum, prosecuting the crimes of this war?
We have set the model by the existing courts. Unfortunately, not every nation is willing to accept an obligation not to murder the people they think are their enemies. So we have enough models and enough different courts. We had a court for crimes committed in Yugoslavia, crimes committed in other places. So there is no shortage of models where to put them. The difficulty is to get them to accept the jurisdiction of the court. The criminals will never want to have a court, but it's up to the public to either put them in jail or put them on trial or throw them out of office. They cannot continue this way to have people of importance in the administration of office telling their troops to go out and kill people they don't even know for crimes they can't even describe. And they kill them by the hundreds and the thousands. That's the world in which we live. And it's the world which I'm still trying to change. I'm 103 years of age. And I'm not discouraged. I say never give up, never give up, never give up.
I look at Russia, who, can we give a round of applause for Russia? Yes. Absolutely, absolutely.
The happy cheers for Russia and Putin at a far-right political conference. That was just this weekend. I quoted former Obama aide Sheikho Minduri. He is my guest tonight. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you, Ari.
We quoted you in looking at the roots of this because it goes way beyond Trump. And it has to be in a time of all of these problems and some unpredictable developments, I would say, in America in the last 5 years. Particularly strange to see the party of Joe McCarthy at the extreme edge of the Red Scare, or Ronald Reagan at more of the muscular foreign policy plank, go to cheering Putin as he invades Ukraine. Your breakdown.
Yeah, I think it's very important to note that the GOP admiration for Putin actually predates Donald Trump. He did not necessarily initiate it or lead it when it really began. And the reason it began is because in many ways, Vladimir Putin's Russia really exemplifies a lot of the ideas that Republicans talk about. Russia is the ideal red state. And I mean red as in Republican, not necessarily red as in communist. Russia is a fossil fuel economy. It is a country where the religious right has a tremendous power in making social policy, which you discussed when it came to LGBTQ issues. It is a country that is a militaristic power, a military powerhouse, perhaps maybe not as much as we thought so before this invasion, but they are a country that actually spends more of their GDP on the military than the United States does. It is a ethno state that prioritizes the identity of white Russians. It is a country where democracy has been successfully rolled back and an alpha male leader is now in place. In all of these areas, we are seeing Republicans articulate a lot of these ideas. Vladimir Putin has put them in practice, which is why so many of them have admired him all these years.
We've seen words like Nazism and fascism thrown around a lot in this conflict. So tonight, to understand what is going on in Ukraine right now, what is going on inside of Russia too, and what's driving Vladimir Putin, we need to talk about a man named Ivan Ilyin. He's important to all of this. Ivan Ilyin, born in 1883 in Russia to an aristocratic family, a graduate of law, who opposed the Bolshevik Revolution and soon became a right-wing anti-communist philosopher. Ilyin was exiled from the Soviet Union on the orders of Lenin himself in 1922. He went to Germany, where his mother was from, and soon became a fan of Mussolini, who had come to power in Italy that same year that Ilyin was exiled. It wasn't just Mussolini, though. He also quickly became an apologist for Hitler. In 1933, Ilyin backed the Nazi takeover of Germany, writing an article headlined "National Socialism, a New Spirit." In exile, Ilyin formulated a vision for a very Russian form of fascism, which he called redemptive. Fascism, of course, a far-right ideology centered on nationalism, militarism, and authoritarianism. Ilyin ended up leaving Germany before the war began and died in Switzerland in obscurity in 1954. Now, you might think a Russian exile who was an apologist for Nazism wouldn't have much support in Russia today, wouldn't be allowed to have much influence given what Hitler and the Nazis did to Russia. Tens of millions of Russians died during World War II, including in the siege of Leningrad and the battle for Stalingrad. Today, Moscow tries to justify its illegal war in Ukraine by falsely claiming they're once again fighting the Nazis. And yet, since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of Soviet communism, Russian elites have been turning to Ivan Ilyin, the Nazi apologist, in increasing numbers. One particular Russian has led the campaign to rehabilitate this long-dead far-right philosopher. And his name is Vladimir Putin. In 2005, President Putin, who is obsessed with restoring Russia's imperial past, repatriated Ilyin's remains from Switzerland to Moscow. And as columnist David Brooks of the New York Times has pointed out, on the same day that Putin laid flowers at Ilyin's grave in 2009, he declared, and I quote, "It's a crime when someone only begins talking about the separation of Russia and the Ukraine." Putin was echoing the Russian nationalism of Ilyin, who referred to Ukrainians in question marks, and who, in Yale historian Tim Snyder's words, believed that to speak of Ukraine was to be a mortal enemy of Russia. In 2006, Putin reclaimed for Russia Ilyin's personal papers from Michigan State University, where they'd ended up. According to Snyder, who has perhaps done more than any other scholar to cast a light on Ilyin's major and malign influence on Russian politics to this very day, quote, "By then, Putin was citing Ilyin in his annual presidential addresses to the General Assembly of the Russian Parliament. In the 2010s, Putin relied upon Ilyin's authority to explain why Russia had to undermine the European Union and invade Ukraine. When asked to name a historian, Putin cited Ilyin as his authority on the past. By 2014, the Kremlin was sending copies of Ilyin's writings to regional governors as well as Russian civil servants. And in 2015, an article in Foreign Affairs was referring to Ivan Ilyin as Putin's philosopher, while also describing him as a conspiracy theorist and a Russian nationalist with a core of fascistic leanings. So, question. If a fascist political philosopher is a guiding light and inspiration for the Russian president, what does that make Putin himself? Take a listen to what President Biden has called his Russian counterpart in recent days.
I think he is a war criminal. He's a murderous dictator, a pure thug who is waging an immoral war against the people of Ukraine.
Tough words. But one word Biden hasn't used so far is fascist. So let me lay it out for you as clearly as I can tonight. Putin, inspired and energized by a philosopher who has been dubbed a total fascist, is now himself behaving in a fascistic way. While obsessing over Nazis in Ukraine, Russia itself under Putin, with all of the cracking down on dissent and arrests of protesters and closing down of media organizations, has become, in the words of one Russian academic, a moderate fascist state. Now, what exactly do we mean by fascism, a word that gets thrown around a lot and which actually refers to more than just authoritarianism or despotism? Well, I want to put up a quote from Robert Paxton, the preeminent scholar and historian of fascism who literally wrote the book on this. And it's a long quote, but it's worth reading and considering in full, so bear with me. Fascism, he says, may be defined as a form of political behavior marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity, in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. Let's just take that last line about goals. External expansion. Well, that's Putin's war in Ukraine. Not content with Crimea and the Donbass, he's now trying to conquer the entire country. And internal cleansing? Well, listen to the man himself speaking direct to the Russian nation just a few days ago.
Любой народ, а тем более российский народ, всегда сможет отличить истинных патриотов от подонков и предателей и просто выплюнет их, как случайно залетевшую в рот мошку, выплюнет на панель. Убежден, такое естественное и необходимое самоочищение общества только укрепит нашу страну.
If that stuff sounds scary to you, that's because it is. That speech was pure, unadulterated fascism, as was the nationalist garbage he was spewing to a massive fascist-style rally in Moscow on Friday, celebrating the 2014 illegal Russian annexation of Crimea. And look, if you are a regular viewer of this show, you'll know I've spent the past year talking a great deal about the F word, about fascism in the context of American politics, and the rise of Trump, and the authoritarian tendencies of the modern Republican Party. But tonight we need to recognize that over in Eastern Europe, we are facing a fascism of a much worse, much more violent, and much more brazen kind in Russia. A fascism that is embodied right now by Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, and which is inspired and informed at every step of the way, as Tim Snyder points out, by one Ivan Alexandrovich Ilyin. Quoting Snyder, Putin has used Ilyan's ideas about geopolitics to portray Ukraine, Europe, and the United States as existential dangers to Russia.
To understand the unfolding catastrophe in Ukraine, I think it's really important to have some historical and political context. First, a quick snapshot of Ukraine. It is the second largest country in Europe by area, and at least as of 3 weeks ago, it was home to over 40 million people. The national languages are Ukrainian, which is the first language of about 2/3 of Ukrainians, and also Russian, which is the first language of about 30% of Ukrainians. Russian is most commonly spoken in the east and the south of the country, but gentle reminder that language is not nationality. Ukrainian history and cultural identity stretches back a very long time, but its history as a nation-state really begins, like a lot of countries, in World War I. Beginning in 1917, Ukraine was for a time an independent nation called the Ukrainian People's Republic, which had this flag and is seen as the forerunner of modern Ukraine, which has this flag. But like the borders and even the existence of this new country were always contested. From 1917 to 1921, there was a war between the Ukrainian People's Republic and the Bolsheviks, who were just coming to power in Russia. And in January of 1919, just after the end of World War I, the Bolsheviks invaded Ukraine in full force and eventually defeated the Ukrainian People's Republic. Among other factions, wars are complicated, and Ukraine became one of the Soviet Socialist Republics of the new Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. One of the generals who led that Bolshevik invasion of Ukraine was Joseph Stalin, who cemented himself as leader of the Soviet Union in 1929. Stalin wanted to crush any Ukrainian independence movements, which for him also meant discouraging Ukrainian language and cultural identity through a variety of strategies, many of them horrific, but we're going to focus today on just two Stalin policies that continue to reverberate. First, the Holodomor, as it is known in Ukrainian. In 1932 and 1933, millions of Ukrainians starved to death because of Stalin's agricultural policies, wherein food was taken from Ukrainian homes and Ukrainian fields and sent elsewhere in the Soviet Union, especially to industrial centers. This period is sometimes known in English as the Terror Famine, to emphasize that it was not the result of blight or weather, but of human choice. So to be clear, the Stalin regime knew what it was doing. These policies were designed to punish Ukrainian peasant farmers who were seen to be resistant to Stalin's ideal of the Soviet Union. It is hard to overstate the horrors of the Holodomor. Perhaps 1 out of every 8 Ukrainians died in a 2-year period. Another Stalin-era policy that continues to reverberate was forced deportation. So because Stalin wanted to discourage independence movements, he forcibly moved millions of people. Almost the entire indigenous population of Tatar people were forcibly deported from their home in the Crimean Peninsula. Many Ukrainians were forced to leave Ukraine, including for prison camps in Siberia, and many Russian people were moved against their will to various areas of the Soviet Union as well, including Ukraine. This had a significant, lasting effect on the ethnic, cultural, and linguistic makeup of a huge swath of Eurasia, from Lithuania to Kazakhstan. And it's worth noting that many Ukrainians today feel there are parallels between that Stalin-era policy and what the Putin regime is doing in Ukraine right now. So Putin has repeatedly attacked these humanitarian corridors people are trying to set up to allow safe passage of civilians from besieged cities into Western Ukraine or other countries in Europe, but Putin has said, I will guarantee your safety if you come to Russia, basically saying you can't stay safely in Ukraine and you can't go west, but you can come to Russia, which feels to a lot of people fairly close to forced movement. Okay, let's move ahead to 1991, when the Soviet Union is breaking up. Ukraine holds a referendum to vote on whether to become an independent nation, and 92% of people vote for independence. In every region of Ukraine, a majority of people vote for independence. And as a result, for the last 30 years, Ukraine has been a globally recognized independent nation. Now, it has not always gone great, as I explored in my previous video about Ukraine, but also independence is complicated in a global world, especially when the name of your country literally means borderlands, as Ukraine does. Partly due to cultural and historical connections, like millions of Ukrainian people have family in Russia, and partly because of economic necessity, Ukraine has had to maintain somewhat close ties with Russia while also trying to remain, a country. Economically, Ukraine has been in a complicated relationship with Russia for the same reason the rest of Europe has been, which is that Russia has a lot of oil and natural gas. Like, fossil fuels amounted to about 60% of Russia's exports in 2019. That figure is similar to, like, Iran or the UAE. And Ukraine has been very reliant on imports of Russian energy sources, not least because at times those imports have been heavily subsidized by Russia to try to curry favor and influence in Ukraine. But here's where we arrive at the crux of the matter. For a country like Ukraine, it is really difficult to have a good relationship with Russia because Russia's leader, Vladimir Putin, has long maintained that Ukraine should never have existed. I said earlier that for the last 30 years, Ukraine has been a globally recognized independent nation, but I realize now that's not quite true because there is one place where Ukraine is not recognized as an independent nation, which is inside of Vladimir Putin's head. Putin, who has directly or indirectly been the leader of Russia for over 20 years, does not view Ukraine as a legitimate nation. And that's not like an accusation, it's a statement of fact. Putin has written repeatedly that he believes Ukraine is lacking in real statehood and that Ukraine was created entirely by Russia. He thinks all Ukrainians should speak Russian and understand themselves to be part of what has historically been Russian land. So despite whatever the talking points are in Putin-friendly media, Putin himself has repeatedly acknowledged exactly what this war is about. He does not believe Ukraine is a legitimate nation, and he believes, quote, The true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only in partnership with Russia. This is certainly not about, as some have claimed, the protection of Ukrainians who speak Russian as their first language. In fact, in the first 2 weeks of the war, thousands of such civilians have been killed by Putin's regime. It is not about denazification of Ukraine, a nation with a democratically elected Jewish president. And while I don't doubt that Putin feels pressure from the NATO military alliance, and I don't want to minimize the complexities there, I simply don't think it makes Russia more safe to have Russian soldiers closer to NATO missiles. Again, this is primarily about what Putin has said it is about. He believes that when the borders of Ukraine were drawn, Russia was robbed. And he is seeking to rectify that perceived injustice through violence, including the mass killing of civilians and the destruction of infrastructure that serves them. I mean, just before the invasion, Putin addressed Ukraine by saying, "Whether you like it or not, take it, my darling," which was widely recognized to be a quote from a song about sexually assaulting a corpse. Vladimir Putin told the world what he was going to do, and now he is doing it. I made a video about Ukraine 8 years ago that ended, "The arc of history is long. Let's hope it bends toward peace." That was tragically naive. I don't know how this war will end, only that it has already caused tremendous suffering. Less than 3 weeks into the Putin regime's invasion of Ukraine, millions of people have been forced to flee their homes, and thousands have been killed, including many children. I hope there is some way forward other than more suffering, but I don't know what it is. What I do know is that no war will crush Ukrainian identity or language. When I made a TikTok about Ukraine recently, a young person commented, "As a Ukrainian, I would like to add one thing that I recently understood myself. Ukraine became Ukraine by never giving up on fighting for its freedom." And that's a good reminder that this war is not about East versus West or whatever. It is about the right of Ukraine and its people to exist in freedom and independence. Putin doesn't believe Ukraine has that right, but he is mistaken. Ukraine doesn't need to be a Russia-friendly country or a Europe-friendly country. It should be able to be its own country, to make its own choices, secure in the knowledge that its borders and sovereignty are protected. I believe that day will come, but I fear for every day until it does.
Vladimir Putin uses the same tactics in every war he wages. Understanding what he's done before can help us predict Russia's next moves in Ukraine. This is how Putin fights. Putin's army has been killing civilians for years. Chechnya in 1999, Georgia 2008, Syria, and now Ukraine. Many believe this isn't just collateral damage. These attacks are by design.
It's intentional bombing. They're attacking civilian targets.
It's a tactic designed to drive as many people out of the capital as possible.
Anybody left in there will be assumed to be hostile.
The first war that Putin led was one of the worst humanitarian disasters in recent history. In 1999, when he was only the second most powerful man in Russia, he sent forces into Chechnya, just a few years after the Russian military had previously invaded under Boris Yeltsin. The two relentless Chechen campaigns set the template for Putin's wars. Russian forces flattened the capital, Grozny.
The months of relentless and indiscriminate Russian bombing have left Grozny a dead city.
By the time they'd left, up to 8,000 civilians were dead. The UN described Grozny as the most destroyed city on Earth. Russia's wars have followed the same pattern ever since. In Syria, Russia carried out airstrikes alongside the Syrian regime. Cities were reduced to rubble. Hospitals were hit again and again. Hamza Al-Kataib is a Syrian doctor who witnessed them.
It's kind of their war tactic. There is no kind of haven place. It's destroying the resilience of the people.
The same is now happening to cities in Ukraine. Russian forces bombed a maternity hospital in Mariupol, and it's being investigated as a possible war crime. What do these tactics achieve? In Syria, airstrikes carried out by Russia and the Syrian regime have been crucial in turning the tide of war. The regime now controls large parts of the country and has claimed victory in a conflict that still rages. Putin wants the same in Ukraine. His biggest challenge so far has been the huge resistance from ordinary Ukrainians. This bombing campaign is designed to make them feel desperate and ultimately to force their leaders to surrender. This isn't the only weapon in Putin's psychological war. He uses disinformation to try to control the narrative. False flags are a big part of this, staging an attack and blaming it on someone else.
Creating false provocations, of then having to respond to those provocations and then ultimately committing new aggression.
His history with false flags goes all the way back to Chechnya. In 1999, 307 people were killed in bombings across Russia.
The government and the mayor of Moscow have been swift to blame Islamic militants. Chechens have vigorously denied involvement in the attacks.
Many historians believe that the attacks were planned by Putin loyalists to boost support for the war in Chechnya and for Putin himself. Within weeks, his approval ratings had soared, and just months later, he became president of Russia. Now Western governments are warning that Russia might carry out another false flag in Ukraine.
He's asserting that we, America, have biological as well as chemical weapons in Europe, and that Ukraine has biological and chemical weapons in Ukraine. That's a clear sign he's considering using both of those.
And this is almost exactly what happened in Syria. In 2016, the Russian embassy even tweeted a picture from a video game to illustrate what they said was evidence of Russia's enemies taking delivery of chemical weapons. The fear is that Putin is setting up excuses to carry out his own chemical assault on Ukraine.
Хочешь узнать о планах России? Посмотри, в чем Россия обвиняет других. Они уже делали такие вещи в других странах.
One of Putin's favourite tactics is deny and accuse, taking a real atrocity that he's committed and claiming the whole thing is some Western invention. Again, we saw this in Syria. Russia and its allies accused these people of being actors, wearing makeup. They claimed it was a Western-backed group, the White Helmets, who'd carried out the attack. But that's not true. It was Russia, and the people in the pictures were genuine victims. And again, this is happening right now in Ukraine. Russia claimed these women from the Mariupol hospital were actors and soldiers, that the hospital was being used as a military base by neo-Nazis and so was a legitimate target. But they have provided no evidence for this. These false narratives help shore up support for Putin back home in Russia, and they take time and effort for Western governments and journalists to examine. So, as the horrors unfold in Ukraine, remember, this is almost certainly not the chaos and confusion that it first appears. We can see what Putin has done before, and with that knowledge, Ukraine and its allies might be able to predict or even prevent what's coming next.
The brutality inflicted by Russia in Bucha and Mariupol, with the targeting of Ukrainian civilians, is only expected to get worse now that this man, General Alexander Dvornikov, is Russia's new ground commander in Ukraine.
This general will just be another author of crimes and brutality against Ukrainian civilians.
The 60-year-old Dvornikov brings a fearsome reputation, honed in the Second Chechen War and Syria.
He is the goon called in by Vladimir Putin to flatten cities like Aleppo in Syria. He is the worst of the worst.
Called the butcher of Syria for his leadership of Russian forces in support of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad.
His signature in war is simply attacking innocent civilians, flattening apartment buildings, bombing schools. Every imaginable war crime can be laid at his feet in Syria.
For his service, Russian President Vladimir Putin awarded Dvornikov the Hero of Russia medal. This leadership change comes after Ukrainian officials say they've killed 7 Russian generals, and Russia failed to take the capital, Kyiv. Now Russia is retreating, moving east, expected to try and expand its control in the Donbass region.
We go now to Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, the former commanding general of the U.S. Army in Europe, and he joins us
from Frankfurt, Germany. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Margaret.
You just heard the foreign minister describe what was happening, particularly in the southeast port city of Mariupol. Many expect President Putin will intensify this assault leading up to May 9th, which is a key holiday. What do you expect to see?
Well, first of all, of course, I agree with all that I just heard Minister Kuleba say, and what's been going on in Mariupol, the incredible courage and resilience of the civilians there, as well as the soldiers who have been fighting. But I do think that the pressure on the general staff to deliver Mariupol finally ahead of 9 May is immense. 9 May, of course, is this annual celebration in Russia of the end of World War II, or what they call the Great Patriotic War. It's a huge parade in Red Square every year. So obviously they need to have something to parade to show as a victory on 9 May. So I think this date does have importance there.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've described a new offensive as a whole new war now. What do you mean by that?
Well, what we saw in the last 7 weeks, of course, was a mishandled effort by Russia. They totally overestimated their ability. They were not prepared for the fight they entered. Ukrainians defeated them at every turn. So, of course, Russia now has withdrawn from most places, and they're focusing on the Donbass region. And interestingly, the General Staff has decided not to mobilize all of their reservists, which tells me that there's not going to be a phase 3, that what we're going to do now for the next few weeks is phase 2, and they're going to focus on trying to gain control of all of Donbass. And I think that's going to be it for the rest of the year, because they don't have the capability, I don't believe, especially if they don't mobilize reserves, to continue the fight after this.
Does that mean the fight could be wrapped by the 9th of May?
No, it means that they will not have the ability to conduct any further offensive operations after this. And for sure, the fighting is going to continue. They're going to continue as long as they have missiles murdering innocent Ukrainian civilians, keeping the pressure on Ukraine. But my sense is that they have made a decision, because of the pounding that they have taken and the lack of resources. I mean, frankly, they can't even build new tanks because the sanctions are restricting the types of parts that they have to bring in for new equipment, that they really are culminating in their ability to launch further offensive operations, particularly towards Odessa, for example, or Kyiv. I don't see them having the potential for that this year. What the Ukrainians need desperately are long-range fires, rockets, artillery, drones that can disrupt or destroy the systems that are causing so much damage in Ukrainian cities, and which will also play a critical role in this next phase, if and when it begins. The hundreds of Switchblade drones, for example, these are very good, but we need about 1,000 more. If you assume one drone per tank, per artillery system, per infantry fighting vehicle, you can see why the numbers. This is about us being the arsenal of democracy. This is about us supporting democracy versus autocracy. And I would really like to hear the administration talk about winning and having a sense of urgency on getting these things there. Otherwise, this window of opportunity we have the next couple of weeks to really disrupt Russia's attempt to build up is going to pass.
Well, we hear from the administration that the aim of all this is to strengthen Ukraine's hand at a negotiating table. But we've heard from the Ukrainians, there's no table to sit at right now. Are you saying it doesn't look to you like the administration has decided they want Ukraine to win? They just want a stalemate?
I would say that I don't hear the administration talking about winning. I'm reluctant to say that the administration doesn't want them to win, but what needs to be stated is what is our objective, the United States? You know, we're not just observers cheering for Ukraine here. This is about democracy across Europe and stopping an autocracy. And so, and of course, the Chinese are watching. So there are implications well beyond Mariupol or even Kyiv. And so if the United States were to say, we want to win, that means all Russian forces back to pre-24 February, all Ukrainians who have been deported brought back home immediately, a long-term commitment to the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty. That means Crimea and Donbass. And then finally, breaking the back of Russia's ability to project power outside of Russia, to threaten Georgia, to threaten Moldova, to threaten our Baltic allies.
Ben Hodges, thank you for your analysis this morning. Happy Easter.
Thank you, Mark.
Here on the Medica border between Poland and Ukraine, former members of an elite French military force are helping to protect refugees who may be unaware that war isn't the only thing they're fleeing from.
This morning we found three men that was trying to get a bunch of women into a van. I cannot 100% say that they were trying to recruit them for sex trafficking, but when we started talking to them, when we approached them, they got nervous and they just left immediately. So we're just here to help.
Many Ukrainian refugees reaching border countries seek to reunite with friends or family members across Europe.
We are waiting for him.
After a 5-day car journey from the bombed city of Chernihiv, Irina seeks shelter on the Suret border between Romania and Ukraine. She is waiting on a friend in Berlin to arrange housing for her and her 2 children while her husband and parents stay behind. Help offered by strangers who greet her and other refugees is abundant, but so are the risks.
There are many very dangerous propositions from different people. They can offer us help for free to reach any country, but it's not true.
Along this border town, men offering free rides to women have been sent away. Plainclothed intelligence officers are on the lookout for criminal activity, and law enforcement teams are advising women arriving at the borders on how to stay safe.
We try to discuss with every couple, for example, coming from Ukraine, especially women and young girls, to have some preventive measures, like to have a full charge battery or to remember every time the number of the car that they were going in.
A recent report by the European Commission estimates the annual global profit from human trafficking is around $32 billion. Sexual exploitation is most common in the 27-nation bloc, with nearly 3/4 of all victims female, and almost every 4th a child. And in humanitarian crises like these, those numbers go up.
The risk for these things to happen is very high. So in times like this, when people mobilize, but the risks for other people that can capitalize on the pain of these families is very high.
The challenge now, once borders have been crossed, is to stay safe and alert until they reach their destination. Gillian Wolfe, Al Jazeera.
By the time they reach here, they are exhausted and vulnerable. And to make things worse, they're not necessarily safe. We've been told by multiple officials in Romania and Poland that human traffickers are at the borders, taking advantage of the Ukrainian refugee crisis, luring women into slavery and prostitution, and taking children to sell on. It is an horrific twist on an already dreadful situation.
Hello, Ukraine?
Romanian police have set up checkpoints to stop suspicious cars around the border areas.
Verificăm diferite tipuri de autovehicule, microbuze, autovehicule, știu eu, care prin construcția lor ne-ar putea aduce anumite indicii. De asemenea, conducătorii auto sunt verificați în niște baze de date aparținând poliției române. Verificăm istoricul fiecărui conducător auto și comparăm toate aceste date.
The traffickers aren't always men. Women are often used because they tend to raise less suspicion and are more likely to be trusted by female refugees. A lot of the refugees arriving now don't have family or friends to go to elsewhere in Europe, and so in their desperation just to get out of Ukraine alive, they're willing to go with complete strangers.
What we know, what we're told is happening, is that people are being trapped on Facebook, online, the other side. So by the time they arrive at the border, it's already too late. They've arranged to meet someone. They don't know really who that person is, but the officials can't do anything about it, and they're already victims to human trafficking. Border Patrol officials that we spoke to in Poland didn't want to go on camera, but confirmed to us that some human traffickers had been arrested and they were hunting for more. In Romania, there is now a campaign at the border to warn refugees and help them if they need it.
It's women and children, and they are already very tired and vulnerable. And as you know, Romania is famous for its trafficking problem, and we just try to come with a solution to protect the children by protecting their mothers and informing them about the risk of human trafficking.
More than 3 million refugees have now crossed from Ukraine in a little over 3 weeks, most of them women and children. There is no way of knowing how many of those have been picked up by human traffickers, but it is happening. The war in Ukraine is bringing out the worst in humanity in so many different ways. Alistair Bunkler, Sky News, on the Ukrainian border.
African and Indian students stuck in Ukraine are accusing officials of discriminating against them and pushing them back from getting to the border. Videos have been posted on social media said to show black people being prevented from boarding a train and left stranded at a railway station in Lviv as Ukrainians were allowed on. Others said they were turned back from the border and were even being shot at. Like this video, Indian students claim Ukrainian guards on the Polish border beat them up and didn't allow them to cross. Tens of thousands of international students have been stuck in Ukraine since the war started.
They're not letting her go. They're not letting the black girl go. We don't have arms. We are students. We don't have arms.
These people left without taking the blacks, man. None of the blacks, man.
There's been a lot of segregation and racism.
Я тобі зараз скажу, хто я. Привіт! Я зараз цей телефон.
These are the black community. We are not allowing any black people to enter inside the gates. We are all here. It's only Ukrainians that they are allowing in. Even the ones with kids.
हम लोग सब रोमानियन बॉर्डर पे खड़े हैं, रोमानियन यूक्रेनियन बॉर्डर पे। अराउंड 500 to 600 बच्चे हैं। ये लोग यूक्रेनियंस को बहुत प्रेफर कर रहे हैं, यूक्रेनियंस को ही प्रेफरेंस दे रहे हैं, इंडियंस को 1 या 2 निकाल रहे हैं एट अ टाइम।
On est là exposé dehors avec le froid qu'il y a ici. On ne nous donne toujours pas où nous abriter au fait. On est exposé avec le froid.
यहाँ पे ठंड इतनी है कि हम बता नहीं सकते इतना ठंड और कुछ शेल्टर नहीं है वॉशरूम का कोई ये नहीं है शेल्टर नहीं है कहीं पे कुछ खाने पीने का कुछ ये नहीं है रेस्टोरेंट नहीं है पूरा ओवर क्राउडेड हो गया है
We are being thrown out of the train. They are not even allowing us in. Indian students are being attacked with sticks and stuff.
We don't have arms! We don't have arms! We don't have arms! We are students! We are students! We are students! We are students!
It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
Undoubtedly, witnessing the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an emotional affair. However, distinguishing anguish and displacement based on one's hair and eye color raises many questions with regards to the apparent double standards there are in our world when it comes to the effects of war and refugees. As Khalid Baidoun puts it, let's not lose sight of how religion, race, and namely whiteness figures heavily into refugee resettlement. The double standard on forced displacement is glaring. Take for example the countries who have welcomed Ukrainian refugees: Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. Poland and Hungary have offered food, shelter, and all necessary aid to Ukrainians fleeing war. Yet in Poland, only 2 months ago, security forces were accused of torturing refugees from Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Meanwhile, in Hungary, these are the images of a fence constructed to stop refugees from entering their borders. That is, non-white ones, of course. Now let's flip the script. Europe's biggest Muslim majority country, Turkey, has accepted Ukrainian refugees for years, without xenophobia and the hostility facing Muslim refugees when fleeing to Europe. And this phenomenon is not new, not at all.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
An argument that you will hear often on mainstream media is that Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, is a civilized place, unlike Afghanistan and Iraq. The irony is, civilization was present in Mesopotamia and Iraq long before it appeared in Eastern Europe. And this is not a tit-for-tat argument, but history speaks for itself. Millions of Jews found refuge in Turkey and Palestine fleeing the Nazi Holocaust. These are images of more European refugees in now war-torn Syria seeking a safe haven from the Nazi and Soviet invasion of Europe. Yet our collective memory perhaps chooses to forget these facts. And it all lies in Edward Said's Orientalism theory. Western narratives illustrate an inappropriate understanding of Asia and the Middle East, lands of imaginary danger, mystery, and barbarism. Yet it is these dangerous barbarians that were happy to take in Europeans when savagery tore the old continent.
Just to put it bluntly, these are not refugees from Syria. These are refugees from neighboring Ukraine. I mean, that, quite frankly, is part of it. These are Christians, they're white.
Russia has indeed invaded Ukraine, an aggression that has been condemned by almost everyone. Yet when the US invaded Iraq and Afghanistan in 2003, or when Zionists occupied Palestine in 1948 and invaded Arab lands in 1967, where is the global outcry? Where is the condemnation? All in all, if Ukrainian refugees deserve our attention and hospitality, which they most definitely do, surely those from Myanmar, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan deserve the same.
I want to talk today about the refugee crisis going on around the world, but let's begin with an old saying often attributed to that great expert in the field of human evil, Joseph Stalin. When one man dies, that's a tragedy. When thousands die, that's a statistic. Large numbers can feel cold and distant and even kind of comforting because they don't feel like people. And I think that's one of the reasons much of the world was able to ignore the years-old Syrian refugee crisis until recently. But then after thousands of refugees died this year trying to get to Europe, one 3-year-old boy's body washed ashore in Turkey. His name was Aylan Kurdi, and he drowned with his 5-year-old brother and his mom trying to get to Greece. His father, Abdullah, survived and has now returned to Syria to bury his wife and children. In fact, when offered the opportunity to resettle in another country, Abdullah said, "Now I don't want anything. What was precious is gone. To talk about the refugee crisis, we need statistics, but let us not forget what is precious. So for the past 4.5 years, there has been a horrific civil war in Syria, which began with the hope of the 2011 Arab Spring protests. Several dictatorships were toppled during the Arab Spring, although some have since ended up with new dictators. But in Syria, long-reigning dictator Bashar al-Assad has refused to relinquish power and instead has battled the rebellion with astonishing violence, including torturing children and gassing his own people with chemical weapons. So back in 2011, Syria had a population of 22.4 million people. Here's what it looks like today. More than 250,000 people have been killed. About 10.6 million Syrians, less than half the population, still live in their homes. 7.6 million people have been forced to flee within Syria, either moving to refugee camps or to areas that are for the moment safer. And another 4 million Syrians have left the country entirely. Of those people, about 1.6 million currently live in Turkey. There are about 1 million each in Lebanon and Jordan, and there are a few 100,000 more in Iraq and Egypt. 95% of Syrian refugees live in those countries, and they have been stretched incredibly thin by this refugee crisis. Jordan's population is now 25% refugees. You've probably seen the huge sprawling camps in Jordan and Lebanon for refugees. And everything is completely underfunded because the UN's refugee agency doesn't have nearly enough money to deal with this number of refugees. And in Turkey, most refugees live in a kind of legal limbo outside of camps because Turkey doesn't expel them, but they also aren't allowed to work. So even though many Syrians have good educations and labor skills, they can't make a living, and so in search of lasting refuge, thousands have turned to Europe. And they pay smugglers thousands of euros to get them via boat from Turkey, Morocco, or Egypt to Malta, southern Italy, or Greece's southern islands. Those smugglers are essentially the only people benefiting from Europe's inconsistent, inhumane, and disorganized response to the refugee crisis. To quote the UN's High Commissioner on Refugees, more effective international cooperation is required to crack down on smugglers, including those operating inside the EU, but in ways that allow for the victims to be protected. But none of these efforts will be effective without opening up more opportunities for people to come legally to Europe and find safety upon arrival. And that leads us to a very important distinction between the words migrant and refugee. This has often been called a migrant crisis, but it really isn't, because migrants choose to leave their homes in search of better education or employment opportunities. Refugees, to again quote the UNHCR, are persons fleeing armed conflict or persecution. These are people for whom the denial of asylum has potentially deadly consequences. And ever since the 1951 Refugee Commission, refugees have had certain rights under international law. These include the right not to be returned to their country of origin if their safety cannot be assured, the right not to be penalized for entering a country illegally if they request asylum, and the rights to life, security, religious expression, primary education, free access to courts, and equal treatment by taxing authorities. If a migrant arrives illegally in the European Union, they can be turned around and in most countries sent home fairly quickly. But a refugee, and most of the people arriving in Europe right now are refugees, they have certain rights under international law that all of Europe and basically all of the world has agreed to for the last 65 years. In short, European countries have no obligations to refugees until those refugees arrive in Europe. But once a refugee is in your country, you have certain legal responsibilities to them, and that's why the boat smuggling has continued. European governments want to make it difficult for refugees to get to Europe. They benefit when the trip is dangerous. If it were made safe or easy, there would be far more refugees coming to Europe. The real solution to dramatically increase the number of refugees legally accepted through non-smuggling routes like a quota system, well, that stuff's politically unpopular. But until legal opportunities are available, the smuggling and deaths will continue. To again quote the UNHCR, thousands of refugee parents are risking the lives of their children on unsafe smuggling boats primarily because they have no choice. And this is true not only for Syrians, because only about half the people seeking asylum through these sea routes are from Syria. Another 12% are from Afghanistan, which was the world's leading producer of refugees for 30 years until Syria came along. Another 8% are from the Northeast African nation of Eritrea, which has one of the worst human rights records on earth. Its government has been cited by the UN for executions, torture, forced labor, and systemic rape by government officials. So about 70% of the people trying to get to Europe are from those three countries. Of course, there are also many migrants trying to get to Europe via these dangerous overwater routes. But most of the people we're hearing about on the news are refugees, and the distinction is incredibly important. Okay, so we have this massive humanitarian crisis. Who's to blame? Pretty much everybody. I mean, the Assad regime definitely gets a lot of the blame. But so do Iran and Russia and China, who are providing direct or indirect support to that regime and doing very little about the resulting refugee crisis. The Arab states of the Gulf, although they've pledged financial support to Syrian refugees, have accepted zero refugees from Syria. Australia's refugee record is truly abysmal and possibly in violation of international law. Canada is accepting 30% fewer refugees than they were a decade ago. And the United States is to blame as well. We've accepted a tiny number of Syrian refugees, fewer, for instance, than Brazil. And instead of talking seriously about how to address the refugee crisis, our immigration debate has become increasingly racist and irrational. For instance, you often hear in the US and Europe that immigrants are disproportionately likely to commit crimes. But that's simply untrue. A huge body of data says that refugees and first-generation immigrants to the United States commit crimes at a much lower rate than other Americans. Okay, and then there's Europe. The truth is, the xenophobic responses to the refugee crisis seen from some European governments are just shameful. Like when Hungary's prime minister says that they must keep Muslims out of Europe to, quote, keep Europe Christian. He's not just denying the multicultural and multi-religious history of Europe, he's denying the international law that requires countries to protect and house refugees regardless of their religious beliefs. Hank, when discussing refugees, I often hear, well, it's not our problem, or we have to take care of our people. But we are one species sharing one profoundly interconnected world, and humans, all humans, are our people. And when the oppressed and marginalized die because they are oppressed and marginalized, the powerful are at fault. 3-year-old Elan Kurdi would be alive today if his family had been welcomed by the European Union, or by Canada, or Australia, or the United States, or Brazil, or the list goes on and on. And I think the reason the world reacted so viscerally to that image of that dead boy on the beach is that instinctively we all knew that his blood was on all of our hands. We have legal obligations to refugees under international law, but we also have ethical obligations to them because they are our people. In fact, one of the reasons we're in this mess to begin with is that for too long we've labored under the delusion that regional crises have no global importance. Imagining any widespread human problem as belonging to someone else is catastrophically misguided, like an Ebola outbreak in Liberia is just a Liberian problem, right? Well, sure, until it's a Nigerian problem, and a German problem, and an American problem. And as we've learned all too painfully, the Syrian civil war is not only a Syrian problem. I mean, for one thing, it's led to the growth of ISIS, a terrorist organization that kills not only Syrians and Iraqis, but Ethiopians and Americans and Brazilians and Koreans and Turks. In recent weeks, people in Europe at train stations and at football games have been promising that refugees are welcome. It's a moving sight and an encouraging one, and I hope that European governments respond in kind. But the hardest work is not in making the promise, it's in keeping it. And this is going to be a long-term, expensive, and complex challenge for the world. And as the UNHCR has said, this massive flow of people will not stop until the root causes of their plight are addressed. The ultimate solution, the only ultimate solution, was outlined clearly for us by a 13-year-old Syrian refugee.
My message, please help the Syrian. The Syrians need help now. You just stop the war, and we don't want to go to Europe. Just stop the war in Syria.
Until then, Hank, until this war stops, we have a legal and moral obligation to provide safe harbor for this young man and others like him. And we also must provide financial support to the less developed countries from Jordan to Pakistan to Iraq that are shouldering 90% of the world's refugee burden.
Government finance leaders from around the world are gathered here in Washington for the IMF and World Bank's spring meetings. They're confronting a slowing world economy and inflation that's at a 40-year high. But finding solutions is even more difficult because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the resulting uncertainty. Joining us now to talk about it all is Face the Nation moderator and chief foreign affairs correspondent Margaret Brennan. Margaret, welcome. The war in Ukraine does pose a real threat to the global economy. What's your latest reporting on how policymakers are trying to stave off a global recession?
Well, the two biggest things that policymakers around the world are struggling with are the recovery from COVID. If you look at Asia and the ongoing shutdowns in China, it continues to threaten supply chains. And also the added risk of this war in Ukraine, which has just skyrocketed commodity prices. So those are the two things they would love to take off the table. But in terms of the actual tools policymakers have, for central bankers, it's really about interest rates and pulling back on asset purchases. I'll be talking to Christine Lagarde, the head of the European Central Bank, about this on Sunday. What we know is that both in Europe and here in the United States, central bankers plan to pull back on asset purchases. The emergency money that they were flooding into the system over the past few years of the pandemic to try to stabilize things. But as you mentioned, inflation is such a risk here. And for central bankers, they have to try to cool things off mainly by raising interest rates. If you think about it, the risk of inflation is that it eventually makes your money worthless. Your dollar doesn't go as far. Consumers are concerned. They pull back. That's where you get that recession triggered, right? If you don't get the balance correct. So you had the Fed chair, Jay Powell, today say that next month you could see an interest rate hike of possibly 0.5%. They've already raised 0.25% at the most recent meeting. So you're seeing that attempt to sort of tighten things up and cool off the economy. But this is a real delicate balance. But in terms of the political messaging you're talking about there at this meeting here in Washington of all the most influential central bankers in the world, the IMF, the World Bank, it was really interesting because that walkout was a political statement in institutions that are meant to really be apolitical or basically, keep the global economy functioning so that you don't devolve into conflict. These were the institutions created after World War II to rebuild the global international system. And what you saw was a walkout largely just by the West. It was the Treasury Secretary, it was Christine Lagarde, it was the Canadian Deputy Prime Minister, UK ministers. Who didn't protest? India. China, the fastest growing economy in the world. You saw that this was the West being most comfortable leveraging financial warfare as a prime weapon, but that it wasn't something that was universal here. You were seeing some cracks in these institutions, but Russia itself, China itself, they're interwoven into the foundation of these systems. So it shows really the limits of being able to isolate Russia in this way. It also raises that question of where do you start drawing those lines if these are theoretically, apolitical institutions?
These are satellite images from the deserts of western China. Look closely and you'll see these huge complexes being built. From the sky, they sort of look like factories or even schools. But look even closer. This line is one facility's perimeter wall. And these shadows, they're cast by watchtowers along the wall. This compound isn't a school or a factory. It's an internment camp. Inside these camps, the Chinese government is detaining as many as 1 million Uyghurs, China's mostly Muslim minority. China doesn't want the world to know any of this. But the story of these camps is also the story of how we know about them, and China's efforts to cover them up.
As soon as we began to document the re-education centers, there was Chinese government officials deleting what we were finding.
Uyghurs mainly live here, in the Xinjiang province of northwestern China. That puts them closer to the capitals of Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan than to Beijing. And Uyghurs are also closer culturally to those Turkic groups than they are to the Han Chinese, China's ethnic majority.
The Uyghurs speak a Turkic language. Their culture is different. They have particular styles of music, a whole rich history that is unique to them.
This is Sigal Samuel, a reporter at Vox.
I've been reporting on the Uyghur crisis in China for about a year now. China has been concerned for decades about the possibility of Uyghur separatism.
Uyghurs have actually had their own independent nation 2 separate times in the last century. In 1933, they established the Islamic Republic of East Turkestan, here in Kashgar. But it crumbled less than a year later when it was taken over by Chinese forces. Then, in 1944, the Soviet Union backed the creation of the East Turkestan Republic, based here. But when China became communist in 1949, the Soviet Union turned on East Turkestan and helped China take it over again. Part of why the Xinjiang region is so important to China is that it's rich with energy resources. And as China's economy grew, so did its need for energy. Today, Xinjiang accounts for nearly 40% of China's coal reserves, and over 20% of the country's oil and gas. It also accounts for 20% of China's potential for wind energy.
China needs resources, it needs energy, it needs the geographical location, the area on which Xinjiang sits. That's where Uyghurs are, that's where they're living. And so China really wants to have a solid sense of control over that area.
As far back as the 1950s, China saw an opportunity to dilute the influence of the potentially rebellious Uyghurs, and started encouraging the migration of Han Chinese into Xinjiang. And it worked. In 1945, Uyghurs made up over 80% of the population, compared to just 6% Han Chinese. By 2008, Xinjiang was 46% Uyghur compared to 39% Han Chinese. But over the years, as Xinjiang developed economically, Uyghurs were left behind, working mostly low-wage jobs in agriculture, while the Han held higher-paying jobs. Finally, in 2009, a Uyghur protest against discrimination at the hands of the Han and the Chinese government erupted in violence.
Bloody riots broke out, pitting ethnic Uyghur Muslims against the dominant Han Chinese.
One of the worst riots took place in the provincial capital of Urumqi. About 200 people were killed and hundreds injured during the unrest.
That was sort of an inflection point. After that, the Chinese really started to crack down harder on the Uyghurs.
And by 2013, Xinjiang had become even more important to China. The country launched the Belt and Road Initiative, a $1 trillion investment in things like fiber optic cables, train lines, and gas pipelines, meant to boost the country's economic and political influence around the world by making it easier to trade with China. If you plot these projects on a map, you'll see a lot of them pass through Xinjiang, making the province arguably the most important corridor for the whole project. China would need to ensure that Xinjiang remained securely in its hands.
The Uyghurs came to be perceived and painted more as a threat, as a separatist threat, as an extremist threat.
In 2016 and 2017, the country enacted a series of de-extremification policies aimed at Muslims, like banning long beards. And Xinjiang was effectively turned into a high-tech police state.
So this kind of thing is happening all over the country, but in Xinjiang, it's been just increased by orders of magnitude. We're talking about Uyghurs having to hand over their phones at checkpoints. We're even talking about QR codes being installed on the outside of their homes.
But the most brutal part of this crackdown was hidden to the world at first.
In this image, you see the opening of this facility. The signage, it says De-Extremification Re-Education Center.
Around 2017, China started building these internment camps, these large-scale places to detain Uyghurs. China says that these camps are necessary because the Uyghurs are a terrorist threat, a separatist threat, people who are infected with extremist thinking.
But it wasn't until Uyghurs who had been detained told their stories that the picture from inside the camps came into clearer focus.
They're forced to memorize and recite Communist Party propaganda every day. They're often forced to criticize their own Islamic beliefs and to criticize the beliefs of their fellow detainees.
We had to sing songs hailing the Communist Party. We had to repeat in Chinese, "Long live Xi Jinping."
There have been reports of death, of torture.
3 guards surrounded me and abused me.
Each time I was electrocuted, my whole body would shake.
So there's this atmosphere of just trying to uproot what you believe in.
At first, China denied the existence of these camps.
他们安居乐业，享受着宪法所规定的宗教信仰自由，所以呢，根本不存在你刚才提到的一些报道当中说的所谓的新疆维族人的问题。
But activists and academics fought back.
A lot of people around the world are scouring the internet for evidence of China's internment camps for Uyghurs.
In terms of the strategies and tools that I've used, I know others have used to uncover evidence of these camps, it's quite simply a computer and knowledge of Chinese and thinking about what words, especially government websites, would use.
People have unearthed government documents.
And then we had growing visual evidence. We're looking at satellite images. We can actually trace the creation and expansion of the re-education camp. It was a matter of I think luck or chance that I uncovered this image. And until then, we didn't have that piece of visual evidence that said, this is what it is, and this is what the Chinese government is calling it.
Tim isn't alone. There's a whole network of web sleuths around the world using basic internet tools to document what China doesn't want the world to see. And they've gotten China to change their story, at least a little.
China was denying that these re-education centers exist until journalists and academics and others started to really amass a body of evidence that was so convincing that China couldn't just deny it anymore.
China took a different approach and started admitting that these facilities exist, but carefully painted them as training schools for potential criminals or terrorists.
实际上，我们这个中心啊，是一所这个寄宿制的学校。
In the meantime, the camps are still there and growing. This camp, one of China's largest, was as big as the nearby city of Dabancheng in 2017. But by 2018, the camp had expanded to twice the size.
From China's perspective, they think it's worth it. They want to make sure Xinjiang is an area of the country that they have total control over. And if that comes with a high human cost and even a reputational blow on the international stage, China so far seems willing to do that anyway.
Now, women in China's so-called re-education camps have been systematically raped and tortured. That's according to first-hand accounts obtained by the BBC. It's estimated more than 1 million men and women have been detained in the camps in China's northwest Xinjiang region. China claims the camps are re-education centres to de-radicalise Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities. Our correspondent Matthew Hill has spoken to several former detainees and workers, and you may find some of their accounts distressing.
Tarsanai Zaiwudan is reliving a story she can barely bring herself to tell. She was held at one of Xinjiang's so-called re-education camps. These satellite images show the site where Tarsanai says she was held, sharing a cell with 13 other women with a bucket for a toilet. And she's haunted by one image: masked men coming down a camp corridor like this one after midnight.
They were 3 men. Not 1, but 3. They did whatever evil their mind could think of, and they didn't spare any part of my body, biting it to the extent that it was disgusting to look at. They didn't just rape, they were barbaric. They had bitten all over my body.
The US have granted her safe refuge after investigating her claims. She's waived her right to anonymity and now feels free to speak out about the full extent of the abuse she says she suffered.
They had an electric baton. I didn't know what it was. It was pushed into my private parts and I was tormented with electric shocks.
It's estimated over 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims are held in the camps. These never-before-broadcast pictures were filmed secretly in a camp under construction and published by a magazine on religious liberty. We've interviewed a former guard and seen his Chinese police documents. He's the first ever to come forward, and the risk of him speaking to the BBC is so great, we've reconstructed the interview with an actor.
Jews who were taken inside were locked in a cell which held 8 to 16 inmates. There were cameras watching them all the time, and there were books about Xi Jinping. They have to study the book and memorize them in Chinese. If they fell, the punishment was severe.
Many former camp inmates flee to Istanbul. Some talk of having to choose between punishment or being complicit in these crimes.
I worked 6 months as a cleaning worker for the women. Han Chinese men would pay money to have their pick of the pretty young inmates.
This was the first time Gulzira has told anyone the full extent of what she says she was forced to do.
My job is to remove their clothes and then handcuff them on their beds so they cannot move.
We can't say if the rape is approved by the camp commanders or even by those more senior, but the accounts of the many women I've spoken to include gang rape in public and are similar in brutality. The Uyghur rights group that helped Tursunai get to America say their full stories don't emerge until later.
Survivors of the camps have told of horrific tortures. Very often sexual abuse, however, is told in less detail. It's traumatic to remember, and women are often afraid of bringing shame to their own family members.
The Chinese government said in a statement that the Xinjiang camps offered vocational and educational training to tackle extremism and terrorism. It did not address directly the accusations of rape and torture, but it added the Chinese government attaches great importance to women's rights. Lies and absurd accusations, including mass detention, do not hold water.
It is very obvious. Their goal is to destroy everyone. And everyone knows it. These women are done.
Much of the testimony of the women, like Tursunai I've spoken to, is too disturbing to broadcast. But it's important, they say, that the world knows what's happened to them. Matthew Hill, BBC News.
You can read the BBC's exclusive report on the Uyghurs with more eyewitness accounts and analysis on our website. Just go to the usual place, bbc.com, and it's in the World News China section.
China didn't get a walkout, and they have more than 1 million Muslims in concentration camps right now. So when do you start saying a country has gone too far morally, and therefore they don't deserve to be heard? It's an interesting precedent being set right now.